And I'm going to try and do them in, well, alphabetical order is how I have them here. So, J.J. Johnson entered the movement in 1966 when he and 2 other Army privates refused a direct order to serve in Vietnam. Many people who are 19 and 20 really don't understand the significance of this, but this really marked the beginning of resistance to the war from inside the military. And he and his comrades were thereafter known as the Fort Hood Three and served 28 months in Leavenworth for their action. He worked as a labor journalist for 27 years until his recent retirement in 2012. He was first at AFSCME District Council 1707, then Communications Director of SEIU Local 144, and finally the editor of 1199's official publication. He has worked actively on climate issues inside SEIU for many years, and he continues to do so. Michael Klare is the 5-college professor of peace and world security studies in Massachusetts. It's quite a mouthful. He has worked with many NGOs on issues of peace, disarmament, human rights, and the environment, and currently serves on the board of directors of the Arms Control Association. Professor Klare writes for The Nation, where a lot of us are familiar with his writings in The Nation. Also Tom Dispatch, he's very often appears there. Also Newsweek, Scientific American, any number of other publications. His 2 most recent books, Rising Powers, Shrinking Planet, and The Race for What's Left, are must-reads, frankly. They're very well written, and they carry essential information. And I think that they're very important for both people on the peace side and the climate side. And you can purchase both of these books tonight at our lit table, well stocked by my co-chair, Gary Goff, at the back of the room. Janet Redman, to my left, is director, I guess you're all to my left, maybe I'm on the wrong side. Janet Redman is Director of Climate Policy at the Institute for Policy Studies in DC. She is a founding member of the Global Climate Justice Now network and works with national and international grassroots groups such as the Climate Justice Alliance, which is playing a fairly prominent role in the People's Climate March. She's worked with youth and women's groups on empowerment through community farming and sustainability here in the United States and also in Bangladesh. And on a personal note, the way Gary and I first met Janet was when we were arrested together in 2011 in front of the White House at a sit-in protesting the Keystone XL pipeline. So apparently there are a lot of good things that come out of going to jail. Sean Sweeney is co-director of the Global Labor Institute at Cornell. Sean works with the international labor community on sustainability and climate issues and has done so for many years. In 2007, Sean worked with the steelworkers and other unions to organize the North American Labor Assembly on Climate Crisis, the first major conference on unions and climate change. And you have no idea how important that is. Getting labor involved is absolutely critical. He coordinates trade unions for energy democracy, a global project that is building support for social ownership of energy, including renewable power. And of course, he has attended several of the UN conferences on the climate. So I'm now turning the panel over to our very distinguished speakers.
Thanks, Martha. Thanks everybody for coming out. I think there's a real buzz around the city at the moment, around the People's Climate March. And the fact that there's been such a great turnout tonight, I think affirms that. Was about maybe 8 months ago when we heard that, or maybe 10 months ago, that Kofi Annan, sorry, not Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, had called a summit And calls started going around, are we going to do anything for this summit? Is there any point? And it's really been a roller coaster since then, and a sort of a gathering momentum around the People's Climate March. What I want to do, I mean, the title of the conversation tonight is Which Way Forward. I think that's assisted, or that process is assisted by understanding what happened in the last 10 or 15 years around the climate talks, and also the climate movement. So I want to spend 6 or 7 minutes only just doing a little recap in the hope that that might be helpful for some people in the audience. The basic, let's start with a year ago. A year ago, or about 10 months ago, the Warsaw COP, the Conference of the Parties, ended in chaos when delegates from Australia and Canada were seen with their feet up on the table, wearing t-shirts, eating their lunch in the middle of profoundly moving testimony from often representatives and delegates from the global south. This was just after the disaster in the Philippines with the Yolanda, or I can't remember the other name of it, Haiyan. And it was seen to be a real affront to the whole seriousness of the challenge. And it led to a walkout of the environmental organizations and the trade unions. And it was a really significant moment to have people who've been spending a decade or more trying to work with this system to have to walk out. I'm going to read a quote here, and it is from Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN. He says, "What now? If governments are unwilling to lead when leadership is required, people must. We need a global grassroots movement that tackles climate change and its fallout." And if sort of fairly mainstream figures in world politics are saying that we need a people's-led climate movement, that is speaks to the seriousness of the historical period we're in and the nature of the climate challenge. But I want to just go back a little bit over the UN process over the years. Many of you know, like the Kyoto Treaty, the Kyoto Protocol. In roughly about 20 or so years ago, there was an acceptance, over 20 years, 25 years ago now, there was an acceptance that the atmosphere was getting warmer, global warming was a problem, and the scientific evidence was beginning to accumulate. There was a body called the Intergovernmental on Climate Change, which was convened by the UN to gather all of the data. And there was an acceptance that certain rich countries, what was called Annex I countries, were primarily responsible for the problem and should bear the brunt of the responsibility to pursue a solution, at least in the first phase. So a treaty was negotiated called the Kyoto Treaty, which the United States did not sign on to, which basically exempted the developing world from any emissions reductions in the short term, but put all the emphasis on the developed world that was responsible for 80–90% of the emissions that were in the atmosphere already and causing global warming. Now, I want to flash forward to 2007. As it was clear that the Kyoto Protocol was going to expire in 2012, many countries in Europe had begun to more or less meet their commitments. But bear in mind, it was a 5% reduction, and it didn't have much of an impact in the overall emissions trajectory. Meanwhile, the developing countries, China, India, Brazil, Mexico, their emissions was going up very, very quickly. So the world in which the Kyoto Treaty was negotiated was not the same world as was around 2007. But I was in the room in Bali at COP13, and the assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was basically the subject of a whole day of presentations by scientists. And there were 2,000 or 3,000 people in the room, and you could have heard a pin drop, hearing one report after other. Ocean acidification, glacier melt, soil degradation, coral reef bleaching. It went on and on. And of course, typically it led to a flurry of speeches from top politicians that we have to do something about climate change. And even though there was a dire scientific scenario being laid out, it also came with some certain degree of optimism. First of all, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change offered in 2007 an emissions reductions trajectory. And it was pretty scary when to look at it. It was a 50% global reductions by 2050 based on 1990 levels. Bear in mind, the levels of emissions have gone up 15% from 1990 to 2007 when we were in Bali. The other thing that came out of that process, though, was this commitment from the G8 and the G20 that they were going to reduce emissions in accordance with the science-based targets. On the other hand, there was another scientific debate going on that says, who says that 2 degrees, or so-called 450 parts per million, was actually scientifically accurate? A lot of countries were saying 2 degrees condemns our countries, the small island nations, sub-Saharan Africa, to sorts of changes that were absolutely catastrophic. So this began to come into the debate. But generally speaking, in terms of the climate movement, which was in its infancy then, there was a sense that there was this process, the UN process, could deliver a global agreement in Copenhagen at the end of 2009. And all of the movement really, or a lot of the movement, gravitated towards that goal. So let's move forward to the 2009 COP, if I have time, Martha. I'm not sure who's keeping time, me probably. Yeah, so in 2009, expectations were high, but if you read between the lines, you knew that something was wrong. Obama had been elected, and he said, we are going to engage the UN talks in a robust way. That didn't mean to say the administration was going to support an agreement, just means they were going to engage in the talks in a robust way, for what that was worth. Then you had the Stern Review. The Stern Review came out in 2006, which was called The Economics of Climate Change, and said, this is a piece of cake. Reducing emissions by this level is totally doable. We have the technology that can solve this problem. And Stern was extremely confident that this was going to happen. It was also a time when the recession was beginning to hit, and there's a sense that the sort of the more liberal wing of the capitalist elite was in the ascendancy. You had Rudd, elected Prime Minister in Australia, saying a new era of social democracy is going to be born, and this time is going to be green. So you had a lot of optimism. But in Copenhagen, all that optimism came to naught. We saw Hillary fly in, followed by Obama. They did a deal, which I don't have time to go into detail, many of you will remember it. It was basically they huddled in the corner, they sabotaged the talks, and they came out with the Copenhagen Accord. The Accord basically said, and Todd Stern, the chief negotiator for the administration, was clear about this even before the talks. They said, we don't need a global agreement on emissions reductions. That's not possible. There are just a few emitters who add up to 80% of the emissions, and they have to get together and do what they can in a pledge and review system. We make a commitment, then we occasionally go back and see if we're meeting the commitment. That was 2009. It was catastrophic for the climate movement that hoped to get something out of Copenhagen. So here we are. The next 3 years of the Conference of the Parties around the UN produced pretty much nothing. Blah, blah, blah for 3 years, all talking about, do we need an agreement, do we not need an agreement? And then you get to a point where you have the walkout in Warsaw, which I began my comments with. So this is the kind of context. And so when Ban Ki-moon decides he's going to call a summit, of course he's not calling a march, he's calling a summit. And the idea is, let's put back on the agenda of world leaders climate protection, because it's fallen down the agenda. And what we're going to see in the summit on September 23rd, in my opinion, is nonsense. It's going to be a day's worth of fine speeches, and we need action. So this means that the march is absolutely important to show the world that the world is going to move on climate protection. But I don't have time to go into what a march means. We all have seen marches in the past. Some lead to major change, some are just another march and we all go home. It has to be in the context of building a robust, consistent movement that's grounded in education, in action, and in clarity. There will be debates inside that movement, how much we need to change the fundamental dynamics of capitalism. It's a system that's based on growth, profit, accumulation, and consumption. Can we have a system that's truly in alignment with nature, with that system in place? There's a lot of debate about that, and let's bring it on. Let's have that discussion. I actually don't think we can do that, but I believe that there's a new narrative emerging about defending the commons, about economic democracy, about democratic control over major economic decisions, and in that I take some hope. But a march is a march. It's going to be hugely significant. But if that's all we're going to do and then go home, it's not going to be enough, and I think everybody in this room is fully aware of that. So I just want to turn it over now to our next speaker, which I believe is you. Janet Redman.
Well, that's a wonderful segue because I'm actually going to talk about the idea of the finance. How do we do that piece? My name is Janet Redman. Once again, I just want to thank Reverend Rivera for having us in his spiritual home here, and thank the Climate Action Committee for bringing us all here. It's really wonderful to be in a packed room. I could stand, but I'm going to have a hard time. I'll try. And if I
had the same problem.
and if I,
Want to use this?
oh, that might be easy, yeah, thanks.
No.
No, it doesn't.
It goes around and around.
Okay, you're welcome, thanks for that. See if I can, see if this can work. There we go, okay, that's pretty close. I get my timer. Okay. Thanks for that. Sorry. I'll start again. Can folks hear me okay now? You see me okay? Okay, great. All right. I'll try this again. I'm going to time myself so I don't go forever.
We have a hook.
Perfect. Okay, so like I was saying, one of the reasons it was really great to follow Sean, as it turns out, besides the idea that it's good to go before the next two because I think it's going to be intimidating to try to go after them. So I'm really honored, first of all, just to be in this space with you all, and I'm really grateful that Martha and Gary brought me here. And I appreciate you lifting up kind of how we met, because I think part of building this movement is about building relationships, so I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. One of the reasons I was asked to talk about financialization, kind of the financialization of what's happening in the climate world. What's the role of the financial sector and the private sector, and what does that mean for how we're moving forward in the world of how we address climate, but also what does that mean for this march that's happening here? I think it's important because here we are in the heart of Wall Street in New York City. A lot is going on in this climate summit that has to do with the questions that Sean asked. Can we move forward in the capitalist model that we've got right now and solve the climate crisis? And while the negotiators that Sean talked about are going blah, 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 the financial sector has actually been organizing itself to answer that question for us. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about that. I'm not going to pick up on the kind of broad politics of negotiation, but I'm just going to lift up the financing side, because while there's one half of the conversation that's happening globally about reducing emissions, the other half of the conversation is how the heck are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for it here at home? How are we going to do the things we know we need to do? Move to decentralized energy systems, move toward better food systems, deal with transportation issues, deal with the impacts of climate, and how are we going to fulfill the obligation that we have as a developed country and developed countries toward developing countries to pay a climate debt that is both morally our responsibility, because we've been able to develop over the Industrial Revolution by using cheap greenhouse gas emitting energy sources, but because it's actually legally enshrined in the UN that we will repay that debt. And that debt is big. So Ban Ki-moon on his UN Climate Summit website talks about tens of billions of dollars to make this transition into a low energy, climate resilient economy. Business groups are actually calling it about $1 trillion a year at this point to make that transition globally. And developed countries have said they will they'll mobilize $100 billion a year to developing countries to enable them to move to clean energy pathways. So what's scary about that is it's huge numbers, and what's happening in the kind of global narrative is taking advantage of the urgency of the issue. Basically what we're hearing from all over the place, we're hearing about it in climate, we're hearing about it in development circles, that we don't have the money, we're broke. America's broke, the developed world is broke, and so we need to get that cash from where the money is, and that's the private sector, partly because we just bailed the banks out, so they've got all that money. But partly because we need the investment sector to green itself. We need businesses to be greener, we need investors to be greener, and so we need to make sure they're right in the center of solving the climate crisis with us. And then there's, of course, the logic that, the market can do this much more efficiently. So we've got these three answers. The money is there. Those folks need to green anyway, and they're the most efficient way to do it. And that's across the board in moving to low carbon energy systems, but also in many people say to build a new infrastructure in a climate changed world that looks very different than the one we have today, and to repay that debt. So we're not just talking about a corporate takeover, we're talking about a financial sector takeover of this climate conversation. And it's happening, it's going to be happening in 2 weeks right here at the Ban Ki-moon Summit. And the private sector and financial sector are perfectly happy to have that conversation, I think. Part of the private sector identifies the fact that, yeah, climate change does impact our bottom line, so we need to do some stuff about it. So I think genuinely, there's a real truth in some of the private sector actors saying we want to change and make a difference. Then there's, of course, the reputational risk that says when we green our portfolio, we get to keep on doing the bad stuff over here because we can just point over there and you can see how green we are, which happens in a lot of places. And then there's the fact that regulation may happen, and so they're going to have to change their portfolio anyway. So they might as well reduce their contribution now and get on the good side of that. But in the world we live in right now, along the kind of market logic, we're also kind of seeding a space that says, well, we value this. We value clean water. We value no pollution in the atmosphere. We value biodiversity. And so the best way to make that value internal to how we make decisions is to put a price tag on it. So one of the biggest conversations you're going to hear in the Ban Ki-moon Summit right now is put a price on carbon. And we're engaging some of the biggest institutions in the world to do that, like the World Bank. And in some ways that might make sense, because if we put a price on it, it's like how you pay your electricity bill. If you put a price on your electricity bill, maybe you'll keep the lights off because you won't waste as much electricity. The problem is that by putting a price on things like carbon, you make an asset out of part of nature. So now we've got a thing that actually is worth money, not just to regulate our use of it, and this is where the financial sector comes in, but now you've got a thing called a carbon credit, or a biodiversity credit, or a water credit. And now you can take that and trade it for financial gain in a whole other system. You can make derivatives out of it. You can put it on Wall Street functionally. And that's part of what the financial sector is excited about. But even before you do, even besides that giant scary piece of the picture, we've got a conversation right now, again, the narrative of we're broke, we need the money, we need to entice the private sector to be a part of problem solving here. And so we need to do anything we can to leverage using our small amount of public money and our public institutions and even our public laws to entice the big pool of money that's out there, the financial sector, the labor's pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, all the big pools of money that are circulating, reduce the risk for the private sector to invest, make it worth their while, pull in money from the equity funds, pull in money from the capital market, attract these institutional investors, and relax our rules so they can meet their interests while we meet the interests of the planet. And that's where the real problem comes in, is around this idea of regulation. And who, in fact, is writing the rules around climate if the focus of our task is to make sure that climate action is most attractive to the financial sector. So again, this idea of financialization of the rules is the key piece, I think, in trying to answer the question that Sean laid out. It's the worry of using public policy and public institutions to make it as attractive as possible for the financial sector to either green their own investments or for the private sector to green its business practices. So it's designing laws to create economic opportunity for green growth, as opposed to talking about what's the public need and how do we reduce emissions while we adapt to the inevitable impacts of climate change. In another way, it's talking about how do we make it as cheap as possible for the private sector to obey the law. So we've got examples of that everywhere. That's like the Europeans' emissions trading system, or California's new trading system that says, listen, we know we need to have power plants reduce their emissions, but it's going to be hard. Economically, we don't want to crash our economy either. How can we make sure it's as easy as possible, as cheap as possible, even if it means bending the rules around actually reducing emissions where they're being polluted, where they're being released, even if it means buying someone else's land somewhere else, reducing emissions there and counting them as our own, even if it means that leads to grabbing someone else's land, potentially violating their human rights, and calling those our own emissions. So these are the kinds of problems that we see when we start financializing the responsibility to take action on climate. Just to illustrate the tight relationship between financialization, the financial sector, and regulation, next week the UK is going to unveil its big climate plan before they come here. But they're going to do it at the City of London. They're doing it basically at their Wall Street. So that's the kind of connection we're talking about. We've just had, there was a big announcement that Obama made around protecting the climate and bringing energy access to Africa. It's hand in hand with GE. He was on the GE podium when he made that announcement. So we're seeing these kind of the knitting together of the financial and private sectors in the climate regime. I'm not going to belabor the point of why this is a problem. It's a problem because the financial sector makes decisions based on profit motive and not on the needs of us here in this room, certainly not on the needs of poor people in the global south, people who are marginalized by their own government, let alone not even having access to much of the sector that we're talking about. It's not an ecological stability motive. It exacerbates the ability for the financial sector to rig the rules when they're at the center of the solution to climate change. And it has incredible challenges with transparency and accountability, of course, around the board. And I'm just thinking of an example right now that we're working very hard on a new fund called the Green Climate Fund. It's supposed to be the place that actually those rich governments channel their $100 billion to developing countries, to the global south. It's just adopted standards that don't meet the basic international labor standards. And that's in part because of the lobbying of the private sector and of Bank of America in that space to say, if we want the financial sector to be right in the middle of this game, we can't have strong rules. We can't have tough rules. You have to make it easy for us to play. So I just want to talk about kind of what are some of the solutions in the sense of answering the question that Sean laid out. You know, one of the big things we can do is start pulling our money out of the financial sector. We've been advocating for a Robin Hood tax, or a financial transaction tax that actually would tax every transaction that Wall Street does. So it's starting to kind of suck some of that cash back out. We can also divest from the fossil fuel sector. So we've got the 350 Divest Campus movement. We've got philanthropies that are divesting their stock portfolios from fossil fuels. You've got wealthy individuals who are doing that. And I think you're going to see some big announcements about that on the 23rd at the Climate Summit. But then we have to think about what we're putting the money into, and that's the other side of this. I mean, we can't pretend that there's no need for cash. We need to pay for the stuff we know we need to do, like community-based energy systems, like public transportation that runs with no fossil fuel emissions. And so we need to start talking about reinvesting in a new economy, and that economy has to be place-based, it has to promote democracy, it has to talk about shared prosperity and have a new definition of what wealth means, and it has to be grounded ecologically in the reality of a climate-constrained world. So there are a whole bunch of places that you can find those examples here in New York, everywhere. I would urge people to look at a website. It's called the Our Power Campaign. It's part of the Climate Justice Alliance national movement toward thinking about how to do local-based solutions to the climate crisis and how to finance that. So just a quick word on this idea of the Ban Ki-moon March, because I agree with Sean that it's really important for us to be here. I also am really concerned that there's no demand in this march. So right now I think it's going to be something like, hey leaders, take action. And I don't think that's good enough, actually. I think we need to be talking about demanding that we get Wall Street out of the Ban Ki-moon Summit. Right now they're set to have a private sector lunch. That's more access than anyone in civil society is getting by a long shot. There isn't even a heads of state lunch, but there's a private sector lunch. So we need to start taking back that space. And I would invite folks, if they're interested in joining an action on Wall Street on Monday after the People's Climate March. There is a convergence at Battery Park at 10 a.m. If you go to Flood Wall Street, that's hashtag Flood Wall Street, you can find information about being part of a contingent that's saying, you know, Wall Street isn't the answer to our climate problem. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. Wonderful contribution. I'm not going to pick up the mic because I think you can hear me, and Michael Clare's going next, so let's give him a little welcome.
Is yours on? Yes,
This is on now. Is that okay? You want me to put the other one on?
No, that's good, that's good.
This good? Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be in Brooklyn. I have to admit that it felt like an adventure to me. I grew up in the Bronx, and I went to high school on the west side of Manhattan, and Brooklyn was always a far and obscure territory. So it was very exciting to get on the subway and come here, like getting on the Paris Metro or some hour on smoke, something like that. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm happy to be with such a distinguished panel. JJ says we were on a panel together when he got out of Leavenworth, and that has to be 45 years ago, yeah. And I worked at the Institute for Policy Studies, where Janet works. So we have a lot of good ties. And thank you, Brooklyn for Peace, for pulling this together. So I'm going to discuss the relationship between climate change and resource competition on one hand, and resource competition, conflict, and human survival on the other. All of these, I believe, are closely related. Let me begin with resource competition and conflict. I study the causes and characteristics of modern war. That's what I do at the 5 colleges in Massachusetts. And I'm completely convinced that most wars that we see today and in history are driven in large part or in part by competition over access to vital materials, vital resources, land, water, food, gold and diamonds, energy, ivory, timber, and in the past, human chattel. We see this in the wars of colonialism, and of course in the past, the Roman Empire and other empires, and the wars of colonialism fought by the major European imperial powers around the world. And we see it more recently in the wars in the Middle East over oil. Now, the other major cause of modern war is called grievance in the literature. That is historical resentments of one group of people towards another, whether defined by class, race, ethnicity, religion, linguistic differences, or nationalistic differences. We all know that many of the recent wars and current wars in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, are driven to a considerable degree by ethnic, religious, and nationalistic grievances. But I'd like to say this about grievance. Grievance is all you hear about in the news reporting. All these wars are defined as ethnic wars. Those people are not as civilized as us. You know, the blood is closer to the surface. They're driven by mad ethnic passions, unlike us civilized people. I would say this, virtually every society on the planet contains schisms along ethnic, race, and religious lines. And we've seen this recently in our own country, in Ferguson, Missouri, and we've seen it many times in the past. These schisms are ever present in human societies. But successful societies, reasonably successful societies, like the Western democracies, to a greater or lesser extent, have developed codes of conduct and laws that preclude the eruption of these divisions in a disruptive or violent form most of the time. Now, we all know that they break out periodically, they erupt. And we've seen that in our own country all too often. But these outbreaks are the exception, not the norm in advanced societies, so-called. So the question becomes, what triggers the outbreaks or eruptions of ethnic and religious and tribal warfare? And I would argue that in most circumstances, it is the intensification, the exaggeration of competition for vital resources, however defined, that triggers these outbreaks. Before the Arab Spring of 2011, for example, we saw a profound drought in Eurasia especially in Russia and Ukraine, but also in Australia, in South Africa, and other parts of the world that significantly reduced the global trade in grains, rice, corn, and especially wheat, reducing supplies in North Africa and the Middle East, and causing a doubling of bread prices throughout North Africa just in the last months of 2010. Of course, the governments in these countries did nothing to alleviate the pain and suffering of the people in those countries who often spend 50% or more of their income on food. So the doubling in bread prices was a crippling blow, and it just took one spark, which was a case of a gentleman in Tunisia who burned himself in protest against police harassment that triggered the Arab Spring. At the same time, Syria was experiencing its worst drought in modern history. Agriculture was devastated in the Euphrates River Valley, the main agricultural region of Syria. Over 1 million people were displaced, forced to abandon their ancestral homes, and had to flee or migrate to the working class cities in southern and western Syria, where they got no help whatsoever from the Assad regime, lived in destitute conditions, and also experienced great desperation and anger. Now, I'm not saying that drought, food scarcity, and food price increases are the only cause of the Arab Spring and the civil war in Syria and other violence that we see today. But on the other hand, I believe that these were accelerating events, triggers that were part of what brought these conflicts to the brink. So my first point here is that resource competition is a major cause of war in its own right, but could also serve as a trigger to ignite long latent ethnic religious antagonisms. This is so because most human societies live in circumstances where they are very dependent on a whole set of complex ecological and resource systems to provide them with the means of survival: food, water, land, shelter, heat, energy, and so on. When these exist in reasonably adequate supplies, and most people in society at least have enough, or believe they will have enough, it's possible to have peace. But when the means of survival become constrained or threatened, the schisms in society will come under extreme pressure and explode. Now, I believe that for a variety of reasons, even without climate change, we're going to see increased competition for vital resources and resulting conflict. If I had more time, I'd say why that's so. This isn't the time or place to do that. It has to do with globalization, urbanization, population growth, the rise of China, and other factors that are pushing up world demand for resources at a time when the supply of many vital resources is either stagnant or in decline, creating a global resource crunch. So this would be true even without climate change. So even without climate change, we're going to see friction and pressure over resources. But with climate change, everything gets a whole lot worse. Why is that? That's because climate change will significantly reduce the supply of many of these vital resources in areas that are already highly stressed. In particular, we're going to see a reduction in the supply of water in many areas, food-growing areas of the world, a desertification of food-growing areas, and as a result, a decline in the availability of food in many of these areas, pushing prices up to the point where people can't afford it, and leading to profound desperation and hunger in many parts of the world. All of this, as you know, is already underway and will become much more severe in the years ahead. But that's the least of it. We know this to some degree or another. But the effects of climate change will not be equally distributed. That's the point I want to make. Many of the worst effects will be experienced in the poor and developing countries of the world that are already suffering from economic and resource scarcities and are already divided along ethnic, religious, and linguistic lines. This is true especially in Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia, where land and water is already scarce and often contested among different groups, and societies are divided, and where the impact of climate change will be felt with the greatest severity. Under these circumstances, it is likely that climate change will impose unbearable pressures on already stressed out societies and produce violent eruptions of all kinds. This is the way the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, put it in its most recent report. Quote, "Climate change can indirectly increase risks of violent conflicts in the form of civil war and intergroup violence by amplifying well-documented drivers of these conflicts, such as poverty and economic shocks. The poor and marginalized, whether ethnic and religious minorities, are especially at risk of being drawn into these conflicts," the IGCC notes, because, as I said, and as they indicate, these climate change effects will be felt with greatest severity among the poor, and people living in marginal environmental and ecological situations. So as we look into the future, the more we're going to see these conditions of distress, not only in Africa, but increasingly in areas closer to us, like Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. We may not see outbreaks of climate change-related violence in this country, though I wouldn't rule it out, but we'll certainly be exposed to the consequences. At the very least, we'll be affected by a growing flood of climate refugees and accompanying anti-immigrant violence. Many of our allies, especially in Europe, will face similar challenges, fueling the rise of neo-Nazi movements, which are on the rise, and which are fueled by anti-immigrant feelings. And also related to this, we see the disintegration and breakdown of states and regional unions like the EU. Many of our key allies in the developing world, like Mexico and Nigeria, could face civil war and collapse, leading to the intervention of US forces. Insurgent, sectarian, jihadist groups will thrive in this environment, fueling unpopular discontent over the existing government's inability to meet their basic needs. This is the essence of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, or Boko Haram in Nigeria. In the worst case, major powers like India and Pakistan will go to war over disputed sources of water and other resources. This is the worst case scenario. In the end, these social and military consequences of climate change could prove far more harmful and destructive to human health and survival than the purely environmental consequences of climate change, which is what we hear about the most, like rising temperatures and the destruction of habitats and the threat to polar bears. It's for this reason that I believe that climate change is, first and foremost, a threat to peace and human survival. And that the only sure path to peace in the 21st century is a path that leads to climate action and global resource equity, along with nuclear disarmament and war prevention, the causes that we have traditionally championed. In fact, war prevention and climate action have now become interdependent. It also means that the climate movement must recognize the peace and conflict dimensions of climate change. This is not just an environmental problem on steroids, but a threat to the survival of human societies writ large, but especially a threat to the poorest and most vulnerable on the planet. There is, in other words, a profound human justice dimension to climate change that we ignore at our peril. Unless we recognize that the principal victims of climate change are likely to be the marginalized, the poor, ethnic and religious minorities who are going to become the troops for the jihadist movements we see if we don't address this, we will not take the actions necessary to avert the catastrophic effects that will unleash global chaos and violence. So to conclude, not only must we do everything we can to prevent the worst effects of climate change, but we have to do all we can to alleviate poverty in the developing world, to protect the peoples most at risk, and to promote equity in the allocation of vital resources. And as I see it, this last point, promoting the equity in the distribution of food and water and land is the most basic and essential task for assuring peace in the world in the years ahead. Thank you.
Shuffling the sequence, shall I move to the left or to the right? Our last speaker, great, thanks everybody for staying. Thanks everybody for staying within time so far, and I'm sure JJ will do the same. JJ Johnson, my friend and comrade, formerly of 1199.
For a while, listening to Mike, I thought it was almost time to reach for the Kool-Aid. But one of the things I'd like to do is to kind of take up Sean's challenge and talk about how I see, where we need to go forward. First of all, I want to thank Climate Action, Reverend Rivera, and the rest of the distinguished panel for having me here today. And lest I appear before you under false pretenses, I want to acknowledge that I do not consider myself an environmental journalist as I've been described on WBAI. I confess to being a labor journalist, but I also should quantify that. I'm currently a retired activist and an 1199 SEIU consultant. And so, although I do work for 1199, I'd like to make clear that the comments tonight are my own, and they don't necessarily represent my union's positions. In preparation for tonight's meetings, I gave a lot of thought to my contribution and what I could bring to the discussion table. I decided that I could best contribute by exploring with you the issues and the questions that I've grappled with as an African-American male labor communicator. I stand at the moment at the interconnection of class and race in our nation. And I've spent a lot of time exploring those connections, trying to tease out the differences and the similarities. And I've come to the conclusion a long time ago, that the two are so intertwined, where am I? In our nation's past and present, that one cannot really be discussed without discussing the other. This is important because it informs my activism and involvement in climate protection. I guess I better keep my hand on it. The birth of my grandchildren beginning about 10 or 11 years ago helped spark my interest in the environment. It was around that time that I heard, and I was struck by the Lakota Sioux proverb, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it for our children." The protection of our climate began to make its way into the front of my consciousness after that. My challenge has always been as a journalist how best to connect the issue to my members' daily lives. Some of the answers were staring me right in the face, but I was not conscious. For example, I grew up in East Harlem, where until the mid and late 1950s, I had never seen a playground. And the roach infestation in my neighborhood had driven the asthma level through the roof. Thus, union work involves organizing members to defend and extend their interests. But this cannot be done without solidarity, the essence of progressive trade unionism. Harry Bridges, the leader of the West Coast Longshoremen's Union during labor's heyday, once said, "The most important word in the language of the working class is solidarity." That has not changed. Struggles are successful to the extent that members are able to build bridges of solidarity from the shop floor to the workplaces, to their communities, to actually across international borders. Chief among the many reasons for the decline of the U.S. labor movement was its failure to recognize and follow this principle. Solidarity is not charity. It is the simple recognition of our commonality and the acting on that shared common interest. Particularly for workers, capital knows no borders, and neither should we. We are all connected in many ways, but often those connections aren't evident. In other words, why should a New York City registered nurse or home care attendant care about voting laws in Texas, the drought in California, or war in the Middle East? I often find by speaking to the member, she reveals in her own experiences the thread that connects her to the larger issues. Now, if I haven't lost you yet, that brings us to September 21st. Climate change connects us all. It is the overriding issue of our time. Of course, we're not all affected equally, but none of us can escape its consequences. We cannot climb under our desks as we did in the 1950s. No, our liberation is not just tied to the people on the planet, but also to the health of the planet itself. And the organizers of the People's March appear to have gotten this right. They realize that this is not business as usual, and that the despoiling of our communities and planet is too important to be left to the environmentalists, and that we need the broadest and most diverse movement possible to make the changes that are necessary. And I believe people are making the connection. I am overwhelmed and overjoyed that as of this date, more than 700 organizations have endorsed the People's March. Is that right? Is it 1,000 now? Okay, 700 about a week ago. 1,000, that's overwhelming. The task before us is to even broaden this and to build a force strong enough to challenge the fossil fuel industry and those who do its bidding in our legislative chambers. I see the week of actions, and September 21st in particular, as the bridge to the far bigger and broader movement that will move the protection of our planet to the forefront of national issues. Individuals and organizations will take different paths to that bridge, but to ensure the success of our mission, we must also walk in solidarity with those we ask to join us. Of course, there will be some at the march that we would rather not see again. That always happens. I'm speaking mainly about those, but I'm speaking in terms of solidarity about those we continually ask to join us, but we're too slowly to join them. Perhaps that's because we don't see the connections. For example, in 1199 and other workers in healthcare, it is easy to discuss public health and the environment. But we are not always able to connect the climate change dots. That has changed somewhat since Superstorm Sandy. Our members, healthcare members, particularly along the coast, were affected both as residents and as caregivers. As we know, warm water fuels hurricanes, and the temperature of the Atlantic Ocean is about 2 degrees warmer on average than it was a century ago. We also are more flood prone because water levels around New York are nearly a foot higher than they were a century ago. And 1199ers along the East Coast live and work in or near the most flood-prone cities in the nation, including Jacksonville and Miami, Florida, New York, and Boston. Hopefully, some of the 1199ers that will be marching on September 21st will come from the South Bronx, where 40,000 1199ers or members of their families suffer from asthma in one of the nation's most toxic communities. They will, to get to the march, they will have to pass the inordinate number of power plants, waste treatment plants, diesel trucks, and poor neighborhoods to get there. Members with relatives in the Philippines, Haiti, and other island nations are also beginning to see the connections. Transportation workers will find their way to the march because they are clearly one of the solutions to the problems. And building service workers who install and use sustainable technology to reduce their building's carbon footprint also understand these connections. Yet, we still have a long way to go within the House of Labor. There are those within labor who have chosen the path of immediate jobs over the long-term safety of our communities. And I think that reflects, at least partly, on our inability to force our political leaders to offer these workers viable alternatives. Rather than build the Keystone XL pipeline, construction workers should be put to work replacing the thousands of decaying pipes in our nation's infrastructure. Why not retire and retrain coal miners in renewable energy technologies? I believe we can find a path to a just transition for these workers. Our demand on September 21st should not be to defend our climate, but to demand millions of decent, unionized climate jobs, not only for existing workers, but for black and brown youth who have had the employment doors shut in their faces. We owe it to them and our sisters and brothers around the world to reduce the use of fossil fuels and empty greenhouse gas emissions. Today, there is no greater expression of international solidarity. We all know that those who suffer from the climate crisis are those nations and people least responsible for the warming. Several Pacific islands are on the eve of destruction. For Tuvalu, the time is now. But so too it is within our own boundaries. The statistics in the African American, Latino, and Native American communities tell the tale. I mentioned earlier the number of asthma sufferers in the South Bronx. A commission on racial justice found that 3 out of every 5 African American Latinos live in areas near toxic waste sites. The same study tells us that approximately half of all Native Americans live in communities with uncontrolled toxic waste sites. African Americans are 79% more likely than whites to live in neighborhoods where industrial pollution is suspected of causing the greatest health dangers. 96% of African American children who live in inner cities have unsafe amounts of lead in their blood. These communities will take the path of eliminating environmental racism to the September 21st bridge. With them will be sisters and brothers demanding rights that were supposed to have been granted to us almost 150 years ago. Among the constitutional amendments passed after the Civil War was the 14th Amendment, which holds that no person could be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and that no person should be, quote, denied equal protection of the laws. The killings of Eric Garner and Michael Brown and environmental racism are connected. Just as people of color and the poor are disproportionately affected by climate change, so too are women overall. This is especially true in the developing world, where women do most of the farming and work the land, but it is also true in the United States. Hurricane Katrina, for example, displaced 83% of single women in the region. Thus, women will take the road to the march of emissions down, women's rights up. The anti-war movement will also be there, and I think Michael and others have made clear that the relationship between global warming, protection of the climate, and war and peace. I'm almost there. No, that's all right.